Hi, I'm Shihoko Goto, the director of the Indo-Pacific program here at the Wilson Center. We're now in the first week of a new Trump administration, and we've already seen a great deal of directives being made that could lead to significant shifts in US policy, not just at home, but also outside of the US borders. What's more, the actions that Washington to take are already reverberating across the world, and the Indo-Pacific is no exception. Of course, it's still early days for this new White House, but let's start with what we do know. Marco Rubio, the former senator from Florida, is the first cabinet member of the administration to be confirmed as Secretary of State of the United States. And the United States is expected to maintain a hawkish stance towards China as a strategic challenge to the United States militarily, politically, and of course, economically. Here at the Wilson Center, my colleagues from the Indo-Pacific program and I believe that the arrival of a new administration also gives the United States a chance to reassess what Washington has gotten right, but perhaps more significantly, what it has gotten wrong in its Indo-Pacific strategy to date, and what policies the United States could pursue to maintain its standing as a regional power. Our publication, Hitting the Reset Button in the Indo-Pacific, proposes a number of actions to be taken, and I am delighted to have my Indo-Pacific program colleagues join me to discuss the report and share their insights in light of the latest developments from the White House in shaping US relations towards the region moving forward. So with that, let me first turn to Michael Kugelman, who is, of course, the director of the South Asia Institute here at the center. Michael, over to you. Let me ask you. First, many have said that the personal relations with President Trump hold a great deal of sway in the new White House. We've seen a great deal of change in the international landscape, but Modi is one of the few major world leaders who has been in office since his first administration. At the same time, India remains at the heart of the broader vision of a revitalized Indo-Pacific. Could India, under Prime Minister Modi's leadership, play a greater role in engaging with Washington in the region? And could there be greater alignment of policies, including a China policy, between the two countries?
Thanks, Shihoko. In principle, the relationship is poised to expand cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. The Indo-Pacific policy, which was Trump's policy to start with, and of course was kept on by the Biden administration, will likely be retained and guide U.S. policy in Asia. Trump has picked a cabinet that includes some of Washington's biggest champions of U.S.-India partnership. There's a comfort level between the Trump and Modi governments. And what I mean by that is that the current Modi third-term cabinet is more or less the same as the previous Modi second-term cabinet. And the Modi second-term cabinet coincided with the last 2 years of the first Trump term. So New Delhi knows Trump, and that could hedge a bit against Trump's unpredictability. Trump and Modi both view China as their country's main strategic challenge and threat. Certain issues that hurt U.S.-India relations in the Biden era, like India's relationship with Russia and U.S. criticism of India's human rights situation, likely won't be tension points on the levels that they were in the Biden era. So this seemingly sets up the U.S. and India for expanded cooperation in the Indo-Pacific in the second Trump administration. But greater cooperation on countering China in the Indo-Pacific between these two countries should not be taken for granted. And I'll briefly make 2 points on this. One, some of President Trump's broader public policies could cause bilateral tensions that in a worst case scenario could distract from strategic cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. So tariffs, for example, could potentially hit India hard. India is a logical candidate for tariffs given a trade imbalance with the US. India's favor and existing Indian tariffs that Trump has often criticized. Trump has described India as the tariff king on multiple occasions. Some of Trump's immigration policies could impact relations. There are about 720,000 undocumented Indian immigrants in the US, which is the third largest such group in the US. US-India tech cooperation could suffer from Trump tariffs, or if Trump takes a hard line on export controls, as he had when he was last president, or if his administration were to make curbs to the H-1B visa program, which is important for Indian tech workers in the US. And in recent years, US-India tech cooperation has focused in part on strengthening India's capacity to be a bigger part of global supply chains for critical and emerging technologies, including semiconductors, in order to reduce global dependence on China. So here is a case where Trump's domestic policies, depending on how they play out, could conceivably have an impact on US-India strategic cooperation on countering China. And my second point comes to the very issue of Trump's approach to China. We don't really know for sure how he's going to proceed with pursuing competition with China. I mean, for now, he seems to have a laser-like focus on economic competition with China. His direction on broader strategic competition, however, is a bit more unclear. He does not want the US. It seems like he would not want the US to get dragged into a conflict with China. He, of course, had a call with China's President Xi last week. The messaging was very positive about working with China. After the call, President Trump said, quote, "We will do everything possible to make the world more peaceful and safe." So this suggests that there could be, even if a modest one, a disconnect between the US and India on China. India, for its part, is most concerned with the security aspects of competition and rivalry with China. China's growing naval presence and power projection capacities in the Indian Ocean, Chinese provocations along the disputed border with India, India's concerns about Chinese surveillance, and so on. On the economic side, India has cut back on Chinese FDI in recent years, but China continues to be an important player in India's economy, and India-China trade volume is similar to India-US trade volume. So each country appears to be prioritizing a different aspect of competition with China, and that could potentially have some implications for how they align their goals vis-a-vis countering China. And so, as the Trump administration looks to capitalize on partnership with India in order to counter China, and it will want to do that, there might be a need to ensure that the two countries are on the same page when it comes to how they will pursue competition with China and how they will look to counter China. Back to you.
Yeah, Michael, that's a really great overview. And thank you too for emphasizing the fact that strategic competition with China has many facets, and not all countries are aligned in focusing on one aspect or another. Let me turn to you, Lucas. So as we talk about partnerships and alliances, and we've seen out of this first few days of the Trump administration, we've seen the release of a joint Quad foreign ministers statement. And there was agreement amongst the four countries that they remain committed to strengthening regional maritime, economic, and technology security in the face of increasing threats. They are also committed to meeting in India later this year. Amid a great deal of concern about Trump and his what kind of partnerships he may or may not pursue in the future, how do you think the Quad will develop, and will it play a prominent role in promoting multilateral commitment to regional stability?
Thank you, Shihoko. I would say that the timing of this meeting is incredibly significant. The fact that this was the first official meeting that Secretary Rubio conducted right after being sworn in is a big deal. I think this says a lot about the administration's focus on the Indo-Pacific, that additionally that these are the three partners and allies that the United States is probably most committed to in the Indo-Pacific, vis-a-vis the competition with China. This is a big deal. In addition to having a joint meeting in the Quad setting, Rubio also met with each foreign minister individually as well. This is really sending a strong signal that this administration is committed to this region and committed to the Quad. Additionally, this is a much shorter statement than you typically see in the last few years of the revitalized Quad, much more at the highest level, but I think there were some hints that you can parse out. For instance, it mentions security in all domains. That would imply a that there is a resurgence of a security-oriented Quad. In the last 3 or 4 years, the Quad has somewhat de-emphasized hard security in its offerings, instead looking towards more the provision of public goods. I would expect that this is changing, and this is already kind of underway. Even at the Leaders Summit in the fall, there was this new Coast Guard initiative that they announced. So this is not necessarily solely because of the new administration in Washington, but I think that does play a large role here. So going forward, I would say that the Quad is going to remain at the center of the White House and the State Department's approach to the region. I don't think that'll change. As Michael said, the U.S.-India relationship is likely to continue moving forward. I think, the U.S. is very much committed to looking at this grouping as a way to countering the larger threat from China. Now, the free and open Indo-Pacific, what are we trying to keep it free and open from? That would be domination by the PRC. I think the Quad statement says it all. We're protecting the rule of law, democratic values, sovereignty, and territorial integrity are upheld and defended. They're defended against the PRC's transgressions, right? So again, given that the broader context here is that I think we're in a long-term competition with China, the Quad's going to play a role here. So that's a good sign. And one other element that's I think significant too, this is really it's not just that this is a security relationship. I think what's often misunderstood about the Quad is this idea that it's one thing. Instead, I would say that it's a shared strategic vision. And again, you see that here in Secretary Rubio's approach and the statement that comes out. They talk about a number of issues, even if it's at a high level. That's a key signal as well, that this is going to be cooperation moving forward across a variety of fronts.
Thank you, Lucas. So as we focus on this outreach by new Secretary of State Rubio, what's interesting too is that he's also reached out to the foreign ministers of both Japan and South Korea. And both of these Northeast Asian countries have concerns about US policy, not least tariffs that Michael had alluded to earlier. But they both have great expectations for deepening ties with the United States, especially on the energy front. And as the United States seeks to expand its energy capabilities, exports of oil and gas are expected to be a large part of the export portfolio of the United States. Kayla, how can Washington leverage its strengths in the energy sector, not just economically, but also from a foreign policy perspective? And what are the prospects for energy partnerships between the United States and key Indo-Pacific countries, including South Korea, moving forward?
Well, thank you very much, Shihoko. As you point out, this is a very interesting and important conversation. I think when it comes to energy security, it is very vital for national independence and resiliency. However, often is the case that few are taking note of this. So I'm very excited that in our report, we can talk about this, but we're also expanding on it collectively here additionally, especially in recent weeks, we've seen more proactive engagement between US and South Korea, particularly on the nuclear side, which I'll get to momentarily. But there really are 2 points that I think is quite helpful to make when thinking about the energy sector and why it matters and how we can really build out both domestic and international contexts additionally. So the first is that energy sector really is the bedrock of our nation's global economic and technological competitiveness. So especially as United States and like-minded allies in the Indo-Pacific look to further critical and emerging technologies, as we think here, advanced semiconductors to AI development and data centers, defending U.S. energy pathways, both domestically and internationally, will be paramount today, as well as moving forward in the future. A really interesting key example of this that's come into a lot of conversation in recent weeks to months has been Microsoft's contract with Constellation Energy to restart nuclear reactors at 3 Mile Island. And this is a really interesting point to think about the long-term possibilities for developing AI technology and the energy needed to be feeding these spaces and fueling it, especially for data centers. So I think this is a really good example domestically of how these contexts tie together. Secondly, it's important to remember that energy policy really is rooted in foreign policy. Faced with challenges at home and abroad, the US and its security partners in the Indo-Pacific, as you mentioned, South Korea and Japan, but also Australia and increasingly India, must continue to foster bilateral and trilateral cooperation pathways, especially to defend energy supply chains and strengthen additional pathways, as I mentioned, for rapid development of technologies and critical industries. So when we put this in context, I really think there are 3 main pathways that can have the most benefit from from the US's interest and perspective, as well as tied to our colleagues and allies in the Indo-Pacific. And the first is, as you mentioned, expanding liquefied natural gas, so LNG exports. Additionally, hydrogen has emerged in recent years as a debate and context to be discussed. And I think most importantly for the past couple of weeks, I would also say advancing civil nuclear energy research and development and partnerships. And so very briefly, I'll just add a couple of points to each of these before turning it back to you and to colleagues. So on the LNG exporting side, what's really interesting here is post Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we all saw the energy spikes. Many people focus on Europe, but the Indo-Pacific was not untouched by these. What's interesting is that in recent years, US has emerged as the world's largest LNG exporter. And as you had mentioned, there's an expectation by reports and other spaces talking about projecting forward that the demand for natural gas is set to rise through 2050, with the possibility of reaching a level that's 34% higher than that of 2022. So this is really a booming space, and the US is leading it. In particular, there's also the possibility for Indo-Pacific partners and countries to be will account for up to 60 to 70% of global oil and gas imports by 2050. So this is very much a place that I think the US government is already looking at, but will continue to pay very close attention to, and Korea and Japan in particular, in combination with Australia, will be quite interesting to see how this moves forward. Now, on the hydrogen side, I'll talk about it briefly since it has had a bit of hype. There's obviously a lot of pros, cons, and question marks that still remain in this space. So what's most interesting is that recent years, both Japan and Korea have tried to be thought leaders as well as industry and policy leaders in the hydrogen sector, putting forth both national as well as industrial policy to help move forward in research and development, investing heavily into this infrastructure and thinking forward about how it's beneficial for themselves. But we've also seen this as being a point of topic in the US and could be a very interesting area to develop further partnerships, even from infrastructure to also shipping engagement additionally. And most importantly, I think nuclear energy cooperation is really where we're going to see some huge growth in the next coming years in the Indo-Pacific. So currently there's 150 operational reactors in the Indo-Pacific with 45 under construction, and another 50 to 60 being planned. Now, when we think about who is leading on the technology side, the US, South Korea, and Japan represent the first, fifth, and seventh largest nuclear energy producers in 2023. And they all signed on to the COP28 declaration to triple nuclear energy by 2050. And so there's a lot of movement here in the sense of technology development and legacy. But when we look at which countries are leading in the Indo-Pacific, that's really China. China and India are the ones who are actually setting up the most new reactors. So this is a space where there's going to be quite a lot of competition, and a space where the US and allies could be losing some of that leverage. And it's going to be important to rely on allies for cooperation, especially in the export space. And this is where I would say that we're quite excited to pay attention to the Westinghouse KEPCO decision, to put the intellectual property rights issues aside, and to focus on expanding cooperation. We also saw an agreement for an MOU of the peaceful expansion of peaceful nuclear energy, so civil nuclear energy, between the US and South Korea. And additionally, I think the last thing that is a really interesting point to make is that the US Department of Commerce historically has really been trying to focus on this. It has estimated that it could be worth as much as $500 billion to $740 billion in the industry, and just developing small modular reactors, as well as new reactor technology and fuel development. So with that context, I think there's a lot we can discuss here. Obviously, we didn't touch on the non-proliferation side and when it comes to nuclear security broadly in the Indo-Pacific. So I'm looking forward to that part of the conversation. But for now, Shihoko, I'll turn it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kayla. So let me now turn to focus on South Korea. We started this discussion looking at Prime Minister Modi as the one who is a strong leader, perhaps someone that Trump could personally identify with more than many of the other leaders in the region. South Korea, at the moment, continues to be embroiled with domestic political uncertainties. But at the same time, it remains a critical US ally amid these growing regional uncertainties, which I would like to address later in this conversation. But let me turn now to Troy Stangarone, who is the director of the Wilson Center's Korea Center, and ask how will the new political realities, as they emerge, in the ROK shape US expectations and commitments to bilateral relations?
Thank you, Shihoko. And, I think for the Trump team, there's probably a sense of deja vu. If we go back to when President Trump was first elected in 2016 and then inaugurated in 2017, South Korean President Park Geun-hye was impeached around the same time and went through a trial by the Constitutional Court to affirm that impeachment. And so really, from a US perspective, I think the challenge and difficulty here is that because you have an acting president in South Korea, because you're going through this political crisis, it's really hard for the Trump administration to take and engage directly on substantive long-term issues with South Korea. As you mentioned in your opening, Secretary Rubio has talked with Foreign Minister Cho, and they have reaffirmed the importance of the alliance and trilateral relations with Japan. But beyond that, I think it's going to be really hard for the Trump team to really try and engage South Korea on substantive issues until this is resolved. So looking forward, we're probably talking about sometime in mid to late April. On April 18th, 2 of the current Constitutional Court justices are expected to roll off the court. I think for the legitimacy of the impeachment case, they likely need to make a decision before then. So we'll probably know by that point whether they rule that the impeachment was valid and President Yoon would be permanently removed from office, or whether it was invalid and he would return to office. But this is important to get to this point because we'll need stability in the relationship. As you pointed out, it's a key relationship. When we look through the Biden administration, you saw a lot of cooperation on semiconductors. This is one of the areas in terms of supply chains of the United States was very weak. If we look at some of the investments South Korea has made in the United States, a lot of focus goes on the new Samsung fab in Taylor, Texas. But the real keys, I think, are some of the things that are coming into the supply chain, such as Samsung also building a high-end packaging facility, SK Hynix doing a similar facility in Indiana. These were areas to where the United States was really lacking in terms of capabilities. So South Korea is trying to take and help basically build out our semiconductor supply chain. But even when we look beyond that, in President Trump's call with President Yoon when he was first elected, one of the things that was discussed was naval construction. And I think as we look to really see the U.S. position in the Indo-Pacific grow, and this is something we talk about in the report, how the U.S. is losing ground in the region, both in terms of military capabilities and in terms of economic presence. One of the areas where South Korea and the United States can truly work together and really bring together capacity is the defense industrial base area. Not just potentially maybe if we can resolve some issues domestically in the United States on shipbuilding, but in terms of artillery and other types of weaponry going forward. We saw now with the war in Ukraine, the United States has basically been unable to produce as much as Russia and some other countries. It's raised questions. If there is a conflict, can the U.S. industrial base really meet the needs? And so part of the solution to this, at least in the short term, is looking to allies like South Korea and looking to Japan. But to really get into these kind of long-term, deep discussions about the alliance, about defense industrial base, we really need stability politically in South Korea. And so I think that's going to be the key going forward and what the Trump administration is going to be looking for. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Troy. So I know we've already covered a great deal of ground, but I want to echo some of the things that you said, Troy, and talk about the shipbuilding aspect. There are many things that U.S.-Korea cooperation could lead to, but I know that there are great expectations too for greater cooperation when it comes to ships, and in fact, there's expectations for a Ships Act to kind of complement what the CHIPS Act had done, that is to say, greater industrial policy to that effect. But let me now turn to the developments outside of Washington and the Indo-Pacific region. Shortly after the inauguration of President Trump, there was a much publicized call between Putin and Xi Jinping. Public pronouncements between the two sides about deepening strategic coordination and mutual support were ballyhooed. So what does this mean? And how will this impact the region's military landscape? And I first want to turn again to Kayla Orta, who is, of course, the senior associate of the Korea Center. If you can kind of talk about some of the changes that we could expect in the military landscape moving forward.
Thank you, Shihoko. Happy to talk a little bit more, obviously, from the side of the Korea perspective. So I think it's very interesting that you mentioned the Xi Jinping side of the conversation with the Trump administration. I think in particular, a lot of us on the Korea front are looking very closely at what's happening on the Russia side, particularly with North Korea. I think as we continue to watch the developments in Ukraine, there's been a lot of conversation about what the Russia and North Korea cooperation is going to look like moving forward, what types of capabilities that the North Korean military is receiving support for, as well as development in, and what that's going to look like moving forward into the future. Particularly on the South Korea side, I think this has been a concern for a long time now that the North Korea question has not been solved. It's been 3 decades, and we still do not have a denuclearized North Korea despite rounds of negotiations and conversations. They are still able to develop their nuclear weapons program as well as test their missile defense programs as well. And in particular, I think we can talk more about North Korea and what's happening there, and maybe also mention that there really is 4 pillars of their nuclear weapons program development. And if I think if you look for, from fissile material development all the way to testing and missile testing, it's really the fact that they've been building up their weapon stockpile that's most concerning, in addition to their missile program. So on the US and South Korea side, there has been conversation about how to address this. We've seen very, very strong cooperation between the 2 countries, and thinking about how to expand military cooperation and exercises. Of course, trilateral has played a large part in recent years. And I think coming back to Troy's excellent point, given the fact that there is uncertainty in domestic context in South Korea, we're going to have to wait and see what's going to be moving forward. But I think in the meantime, the cooperation between the 2 countries on the military and the defense side remains very strong. So I think I'll end it there.
Great. Thank you. Lucas Myers, who is, of course, the Senior Associate for Southeast Asia with the Indo-Pacific Program. You started us off describing the significance of the Quad and what we can expect moving forward. How does this multipolarity, right, this increased relation between Russia and China mean, and does this motivate the Quad even further for cooperation? And if so, how so?
I think, so there are some folks in the foreign policy community who think that there might be some daylight between Russia and China. Now, I think that there is daylight between Russia and China, but I think the fundamental fact of the matter is that the Russia-China relationship is here to stay. They both identify the United States as their primary, competitor, rival. And so thus far, I think there is a real structural impetus behind the Moscow-Beijing relationship. We saw that in the phone call. I think the timing of the phone call is everything. It says and sends a message that Russia and China are going to cooperate, and we're going to stand together, on our various issues and back each other up where we can. So, in this system, though, the challenge for the United States and what makes it more complicated than than a bipolar system would have been is in a competition where the world is full of rising actors, emerging markets, very much a changing economic and technological landscape. Countries have choices, and many countries, especially in the Indo-Pacific, among emerging markets, they're going to hedge. They don't want to line up on either side in this competition. And so Russia and China are presenting themselves as options. And you're seeing countries in, say, Southeast Asia find that appealing. Okay, let's go to the BRI for money. Let's go to the Russians for energy. And that's something that I think the US really needs to grapple with. And I don't think we fully understand the implications of that. Basically, what it means is that going forward, the US has to be the preferred partner on energy, right? We can provide, we can sell natural gas, right? We can put that forward as a way. We can, revitalize business opportunities. These are things that we need to do to actively make ourselves appealing. Otherwise, I think the Russian and Chinese sort of relationship, they're going to put themselves forward. They're going to partner on these things, and they're going to try to outcompete us. And so we need to be aware of this and really be an active player and not just defend a status quo that frankly hasn't really advanced our interests in some time.
Great, thank you. Roy, I know you wanted to add something here.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Lucas was saying about having other options in the region. And, if we really look at the last 10 years, decade or so, the United States has lost ground. And this is one of the things in the report that we point out. If you look at this in terms of trade, the United States went from, around the beginning of the century to now, from being the leading trading partner for virtually all the countries in the region to China being their leading trading partner. Over the last decade or so, we've seen investment by China in terms of foreign direct investment and both corporate investment begin to surpass US investment in the region. And so all of that has really started to reshape the region. And at the same time, it's not just a question of options, but it's a question of, a lot of countries look at this as, who has done what for me lately? And so that, I think, is one of the keys that the Trump administration needs to grapple with. Now, we've seen in the new executive orders, there is a pause on foreign direct investment through state and other agencies. There's going to be a review. One of the things that I think is going to be key for the administration to think about is how do we take and move towards investing more in economic development in the Indo-Pacific? And one of the keys that we need to take and look at when we do this is not just, because clearly there are concerns about trade with the United States and the region, but how does the region trade more with itself? And by that, I mean interregional trade outside of China. And so are there ways that we can take and use foreign direct investment to boost trade between, Korea and Indonesia or other allies and partners to really try and reshape the region so that way the region remains open to US economic interests, it remains open to US views on rules for engagement on economic issues, and really remains viable rather than take and slowly drifts into China's orbit.
Michael, I know you have some thoughts on this too.
Yeah, thanks. Just to add a bit to what Lucas and Troy had to say about how countries in the Indo-Pacific look at their relationships with Russia and China, and the support that they get from those countries, bringing it to South Asia. Several key U.S. Indo-Pacific partners in South Asia, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Maldives, all come to mind. They all have relatively new leaders that are more China-friendly than their predecessors, and they're especially keen to better balance their country's relations with both India and China. So, the notion of trying to hope that they could reduce their dependence on China may in principle not play well, unless, of course, the US can step up and fill the gap created by reduced dependence on China. It would be a very large gap for the US to fill, but given how rigorously President Trump appears to want to pursue the economic competition with China, it may well be something that his administration is willing to try to do. And if you look at India, yeah, this would be maybe the South Asian country one would most expect to want to step back a bit from China, particularly commercially, economically, given its own competition with Beijing. But it's interesting that India has been willing to step back from China, but only to a limit. So very soon after it had that deadly border clash with China in 2020, it started banning all of these Chinese apps, including TikTok. But it didn't halt trade. I think I got into this a bit before. It didn't end investment. And what's interesting is in the last few months, there have been a number of senior Indian officials, including the top economic advisor, that have called for India to loosen scrutiny. The scrutiny on potential new Chinese investments in India because of the view that more Chinese FDI would actually it would help ease India's trade imbalance with China and help strengthen struggling Indian sectors like manufacturing. So I think that the new administration in Washington will have to think these issues through because it's certainly a complex issue.
And Michael, if I can add to that complexity, we see partnerships developing not just amongst US allies and partners, but also amongst the Global South in particular. And I'm thinking especially about the BRICS, beyond that has expanded its membership beyond the original 5. And so we have countries like the UAE and Ethiopia, which presumably are quite different in how where their interests lie, but at the same time there is a cohesion to the BRICS. There is a greater commitment to ensure that there is coordinated efforts for investment, coordinated efforts for de-dollarization, coordinated efforts to be resilient to sanctions from the United States. Whether the BRICS and other groupings can actually meet those goals is one thing. But what I can say, I believe, is that there is a shared disgruntlement about US dominance on the economic front, especially on the financial systems. How do you expect the BRICS to develop, and how can countries like India actually provide an alternative, or whether there is appetite to provide an alternative vision here?
Thanks. I assume that was for me. Yeah, it's a great question. I would argue that India actually is one of the biggest beneficiaries of the expansion of BRICS. BRICS has always been a very important entity for India because it essentially it helps India advance its strategic autonomy, which entails working with countries across the board. That includes countries in the global south. That includes countries in the West. Be a bad thing for India because it could suggest that an entity that tries to project itself as an alternative to Western models and so on could be bad for India because India doesn't want to upset the West, so to speak. But I don't necessarily see it that way. I don't see BRICS as anti-West. And if you look at the new members that are coming in to join, most of them are actually quite keen to engage with the West commercially, economically. The other thing that I would say is that we shouldn't overstate just how much of a threat, so to speak, BRICS could pose to Western-led economic models. I think that we've been talking about this notion of trying to reduce dependence or decoupling from countries here and there, but the initiatives that BRICS has tried to come out with haven't really amounted to much, quite frankly. There's not much substance to what's come out of them, and that's because all of the BRICS countries are very reluctant to decouple from the dollar, so to speak. But I do think, as you said before, what really resonates about BRICS, and again, I think this will be something for the new administration to consider. The fact that you have so many countries, or a number of countries, join BRICS. You had a large number of countries that went to that BRICS summit in Russia, and I think that really does capture this global discontent, particularly playing out in the global South countries, about the U.S. and its dominance and the dominance of the West. And I think it's certainly something to grapple with.
Yeah, so as we talk about strategic competition and how to define it, and certainly this competition for the global South, the United States has not invested as much as it could have. It is trying to play catch up, but at the same time, it is trying to be much more strategic in its approach to have a more comprehensive global South outreach and investment strategy as well. Lucas, your thoughts?
I think it's interesting. So one of the newer members of BRICS is Indonesia, right? And this is something that this is a country the US has put a lot of effort into cultivating in the last few years. And it's something that I would anticipate to continue. It's a very strategic place. It's the largest country by population in Southeast Asia. It's actually the fourth largest country on Earth by population, but it just doesn't get that level of attention often. But it joined the BRICS recently. But it also applied and it indicated an interest in entering the OECD, right? I think this complexity, this multi-alignment, this in as the Indonesians would call it, and independent and active foreign policy. These are things that are real, and on some level, I think the Trump administration is going to be well placed to deal with this because there's this sort of transactional approach to these interests. And in many cases, what you hear from Southeast Asian colleagues is, well, we can do business here. We understand that this is a sort of give and take, right? You have interests, we have interests. Our economy has this focus, your economy has these issues. Let's talk and come to some sort of deal. I think that deal-making approach could potentially present an avenue for navigating this increasingly complex world where values are in play and important and drive many of these relationships, including the Quad. But at the same time, you can't forget the interests, right? And I think that's something that to watch and pay attention to. But in Southeast Asia, this actually could play well.
Yeah, and definitely this focusing much more on shared interests rather than values does give that opportunity for a more pragmatic, as you described it, a more transactional approach to not only diplomatic relations, but also when it comes to military partnerships as well. And so let me turn to this perennial problem that we've had over the last really decade, but it has become very striking post-COVID, is this idea of de-risking versus the possibility of decoupling in certain areas from China and from authoritarian governments. So reducing dependence on China is expected to be a major goal for this new administration. And certainly de-risking from China is a shared interest amongst some of the United States' key allies and partners in the region as well. The question is which industries, which sectors, and how to go about it. From a US perspective, this becomes a strategic goal as well, that it does not want to vanquish its position as the world's leading military as well as economic power. Other countries, the middle powers of the Indo-Pacific, are not as focused on it. They want to ensure that their relevance and their critical industries are protected, that they remain competitive in certain select industries, that their securities, their military concerns are secured. But at the same time, that doesn't necessarily align completely with what the United States is looking at in terms of what the end goal, a vision of victory towards China would be. So let me ask first, anyone who wants to go first, what does a favorable balance of power mean for the region? Where can we see a new regional order, and what kind of regional order can we expect to emerge?
I'll take a stab. I think a favorable balance of power is something to where the United States is able to manage the military rise of China to create a stable balance of power to where China doesn't feel it has the ability or the assurance that it could win a war against the United States, to where the United States takes and begins to shift the economic advantages China has in the region. So that way we have a region that is more amenable to US rules and interests in terms of economic engagement. But, beyond that, I think one of the challenges that the Trump administration is going to face, some of the things you talked about, Shihoko, in terms of, this question of decoupling and what it means, I think for a lot of our allies and then partners in the region, it's going to start getting into specific issues and challenges. If we look at some of the EEOs, for example, one of them, the one on building out US energy, it talks about critical minerals. And it also talks about, initially this seems to be focused on China, about are there policies governments have in place that inhibit the trade and the flow of critical minerals? Clearly that's China, but Indonesia has a policy in place that nickel cannot be exported unless it has been processed in Indonesia. I think we're going to see this come to a head with the Trump administration likely. If you look at this from the other direction, we started with the Trump administration on export controls. The Biden administration has taken and advanced them, but Korea, Japan are probably both going to face challenges in the semiconductor side in terms of what types of new export controls get put in place by the Trump administration to try and prevent technology from going into China. And then more broadly in the region, one of the things that has been talked about is this idea of a universal tariff. And there's been some discussion, which President Trump has denied, that maybe will only be on certain sectors that are seen as strategic and important for industrialization in the United States. But whether it's more narrow or it is, more broad, I think one of the major things that the Trump administration wants to solve or stop is what we saw when they first put the tariffs on China, to where companies said, okay, well, then we'll move our plants to Vietnam, we'll move to somewhere else in the region, and we'll just ship to the United States from there, so that way we can avoid the tariff. And you still had goods from Chinese companies, even if they weren't coming from China, coming to the United States. And so I think when the universal tariff comes in place, that is going to be something that is going to be a challenge for the region. And you're already seeing discussion in terms of Mexico and the 25% tariff. Some auto companies saying, parts companies rather, saying, well, we'll just move to Vietnam or we'll move to the Philippines. I think this is what they're going to try to take and prevent, which is the movement of things to countries with lower tariffs, so that way you can still export to the United States. And so I think all of this in terms of our engagement with the region is going to sort of start coming to a head as we see these reviews that are being put in place on trade and on energy start coming out the reports. We start seeing policy come into place.
Kayla.
Yes, I think there's a couple of points here I thought was interesting from Troy's comment. I want to build on them in the context of both the fact that there's a connection between the military as well as the economic side. So Shihoko, I think your points about de-risking and decoupling is what a lot of DC has been focused on, especially around the conversation of the new Trump administration, thinking of tariffs, thinking of what this will mean for key industries. But when thinking about the larger possibilities for the Indo-Pacific, I think we would be remiss not to think more about the strategic and military dynamics as well. And so when looking at the advancement of technology, emerging technology, and critical technology, we need to remember the dual use nature. And I think we've already seen proactive efforts historically about the US taking point in such spaces such as nuclear energy. But I think, AI is going to play a huge role. We're already seeing large amounts of investment around the globe and building out these spaces, not just thinking about the data centers, but also thinking about what these technologies will mean moving forward. And we have to remember that there will be both commercial and potentially military implications. And so when looking at the US leadership in the region and looking at the possibilities of where technology overlaps with security, I think will be increasingly important for us to pay attention to what spaces are dual use and where should the US and allies be leading? Where should they be pushing to the next fold in these spaces? I know that we've already seen in recent weeks an announcement by Japan to support, I think it was quite a lot of money coming into that, the AI space and also in that development sector. And so Trump very much championing that movement. We've also seen the UAE as well. And obviously, as Troy mentioned, historically, South Korea in the past years has been one of the largest players in direct for FDI into the US, particularly on chips and semiconductors. So these are very key spaces where we need to be pulling ahead, and we should be looking at how we are competing with China. We should also be paying close attention to the de-risking element, industry to industry. But I think moving forward and answering the question about what will this mean for the Indo-Pacific region as a whole, and how can we envision an Indo-Pacific strategy that takes into context the future of technology will also be very, very important.
Yeah, and thank you, Kayla, for raising the OpenAI, SoftBank, Oracle data center initiative. So we've come, again, this is the first week of the Trump administration. We've had the release of a slew of executive orders, and we've had this big announcement of putting up to $500 billion into AI data centers in the United States now. And the work is already in play in Abilene, Texas. The initial commitment is for 100 billion, so it goes up to 500 billion. A couple of things on this. One is that there is greater expectation on the part of advanced economies, private companies of advanced economies, especially in Northeast Asia, as well as in Europe, about how to invest more in the United States on critical technologies to ensure that there is continued partnership with the United States that would also lead to greater military industrial cooperation as well. The second issue, of course, is about how technology will actually shape US economic policy and in turn shape the economic policies of other countries in the Indo-Pacific as well. Hoping if any of you have some thoughts about this, whether we can actually learn more or expect more similar deals, not perhaps at the same scale, but ambitions to invest more in advanced technology. And what happens then to the manufacturing sector, right? Is it all going to be on AI and semiconductors, or can we actually see a renaissance of a US industrial complex that will partner with other countries? I'm seeing Troy.
Yeah. So I think we will see additional investments. This is something clearly that President Trump is going to push for. Will they go beyond AI? I think yes. I think we'll start. One is going to be, I think, in the advanced defense industrial space. I think there's going to be a real desire to see companies with solid cutting-edge technologies invest in production in the United States. So, one, we can start there. But two, there's been some work between Korea and the US and some other countries on things like quantum computing. And this has significant implications both for not just the future of AI, but the future of national security. Quantum computers can crack most encryption and other types of things. And so really making sure the United States stays on the cutting edge of that and that our partners stay on the cutting edge, I think is going to be important. So I think we'll see investments in, quantum. There's also been a lot of desire to see investments, I think, in terms of the pharmaceutical space, and this goes back to the pandemic and knowing that a lot of the drug precursors are no longer produced in the United States, or not even in allied or friendly countries. And so I think building up the pharmaceutical space in another area will probably see that, and so advanced drugs as well. And so I think there will be this desire for that, and I think we will see different companies from different countries in the region investing in the US to try and build out some of these sectors.
Great. This actually is going to lead to my final question, and it's really quite open-ended, and I'm hoping all of you can answer. So at his inauguration speech, Trump talked about a so-called golden age coming on the horizon for the United States. So what does that golden age look like is, of course, one question, but the more important question, I believe, is about how this vision of a robust new dawn for the United States actually be compatible for some of the ambitions and aspirations that the Indo-Pacific countries have, and what would a win-win for both the United States and the Indo-Pacific look like. So let me start in the reverse order that we began this conversation and turn to you again, Troy.
So, this is interesting because some of this will require give and take, I think, both on the part of the United States and partners in the region. But I think it also comes down to, and this is something Lucas mentioned early on, the transactional nature of this. When the Trump administration puts forward their desire for more investment in the United States to start changing some of the economic relationship, will countries take and push back, or will they see it as an opportunity to approach the Trump administration and say, all right, listen, let's negotiate. These are some of the things we'd be interested in seeing. Can you maybe help get investment or FDI into these areas here? And so if you get to a more fruitful discussion that is looking at what's in the interest of both sides and that tries to negotiate out some new type of economic arrangement, then this is something that could potentially bring benefits for both sides. But I think it's going to have to be something to where there's a desire from both sides, both our partners in the region and the administration, to see forward a new type of economic arrangement, but one that doesn't just benefit the United States. Because if we're only looking to benefit the United States, it's going to be hard to make this beneficial for everyone else. But that also looks at the interests of our allies and partners as well and tries to balance those maybe better than they have been in the past.
Great. Kayla.
I think Troy already said it quite excellently, thinking about how to balance with partnerships. I will add that it's an interesting thought experiment, Shihoko, so thank you for putting it to us to think through what would the golden age look like in the US as well as with our Indo-Pacific allies in the region, and what shape would that take in the future? I think foremost, I think it would have to involve an opportunity and ability for economic growth in the region that is not hindered by retaliatory action by, say, for example, China or other actors in the region. I think it would also include countries being able to take steps to secure their territories and their boundaries and the borders. And I think particularly South Korea's case, this is also why North Korea will continue to come up in the conversation. And I expect as we move into the Trump administration, we could see a re-engagement on what the answer to the question mark of North Korea could be. Obviously, we saw advancements in that relationship during the first Trump term. And so there's quite a bit of speculation of what this could look like moving forward. But I think that is quite high on the agenda for the Indo-Pacific, not only to think about China, but to think about North Korea. And then lastly, to Troy's excellent point about balancing with the partnerships, especially if we're moving back into a transactional relationship and thinking less multilateral, less minilateral, and more bilateral. I think it will be increasingly important for countries to be able to put forward not only examples, but strong narratives to say where they are already committed to the United States. In South Korea's case, if the conversation is going to go around defense spending, and as it often does return to, Korea is in a very interesting and very, I think, strong position to be able to push back on certain elements, or at least put forward what they've already accomplished. So thinking of Pyeongtaek's military base and how much South Korea covered directly the cost to be able to build that military base, as well as other examples I already mentioned for FDI. And so I think there's some conversation around, if it's transactional, what sections is the Trump administration going to focus on, and where are these countries already paying forward, so to speak, whether it's military or economic cooperation?
Thank you. Lucas.
I'll keep it quick, but I also want to reconceptualize some of this. President Trump in his inauguration speech talked about a new golden age. He talked about really putting ambition back at the center of the US sort of mindset, going to Mars. I would say that one of these things is people talk about an American century, right? One, I don't think we really got that whole century yet. It's not yet this time to put, turn the lights off on the U.S. Prosperity, U.S. leadership in the region. And then the second point is that looking ahead to the future, the economic center of gravity in the world has shifted to the Indo-Pacific. I would argue that the U.S. is an Indo-Pacific power, and this is where we need to play to win. This is where that American century can be extended into the future. This is that ambition should be, let's be present here. Let's focus our efforts, our economic, our military, our attention on the Indo-Pacific. Let's make this the center of global technological growth, innovation, prosperity. As my colleagues have already said, I think this is where the future can be made. And I would say that to the Trump administration's plan across the board, I think the Indo-Pacific should be at the center of it.
Thank you. Michael, you have the final word.
Thanks. Just a 20-second point on the comments earlier about the favorable balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. I think it's important to sort of step back and remember that in South Asia, much like the broader global South, which is a big part of the Indo-Pacific, there's a lot of support for more multipolarity, and India is especially vocal on this issue. And in principle, more multipolarity means the dilution of U.S. power. So I think it's an interesting question as to what the Trump administration might think about that view, given that President Trump is all about making America great and strong, but he also may want to rein in the U.S. role abroad. In terms of the question about the golden age, based on what he said in his inauguration address, the idea of an American global age is about, at least in part, the idea of the U.S. being respected around the world. And in the case of the Indo-Pacific, I think that's something that would be seen as a good thing. I mean, most countries in the region, not all, but most want the U.S. to succeed. If you look at recent public opinion surveys from Pew and others of U.S. allies and partners in Asia, you see strong public support for the U.S., including more people viewing the U.S. positively than China. And even in Southeast Asia, where surveys show declining confidence in the U.S. as a strategic partner, there's still a preference to align with the U.S. over China. But bottom line, as I see it, a key goal for the new administration will be ensuring that respect for the U.S. remains in place in the Indo-Pacific.
Great, thank you all so much. So obviously this is still early days in the new administration, but it is encouraging for us focused on the Indo-Pacific that despite the ongoing conflict in Russia and continued uncertainties in the Middle East, the administration is focused on the Indo-Pacific. And as Lucas said, this is seen as the region of not just a threat, a systemic threat because of China, but also it is a region that provides a great deal of opportunity for growth, bearing in mind that it is the most populous, the most economically dynamic region. So the fact that the administration is focusing so much of its attention on the Indo-Pacific is deeply heartening. And my colleagues and I, we will continue to work together and reach out to the US government, including the White House and Congress, to think about opportunities to readdress and reshape the US Indo-Pacific strategy. Our publication, Hitting the Reset Button in the Indo-Pacific, is available online. And you can also come into the Wilson Center anytime and get a hard copy as well. Thank you very much for listening, and we look forward to engaging with you on another event. Thanks. Bye-bye.